Miroslava Ґонґадзе, and you are watching the roundtable discussion about the upcoming parliamentary election in Ukraine that will take place on October 28, 2012. Today we will talk about the current political situation in Ukraine, the significance of this election, the fairness of the campaign process, and the role of NGO and election monitoring efforts. I would like to welcome my guest, Nadією Dюk, Vice President of National Endowment for Democracy, Ketty Fokс, Deputy Director of the Eurasia Department at NDI, and Senior Fellow of Pітерсона Андерсом Aslondom. October 28 election campaign is drawing a lot of attention in Brussels and Washington. What is significance of this election, and how do you see it going?
The Europeans have stated very clearly that if the association agreement that Ukraine has been negotiating and in discussions on for the last 5 years, if it is to be signed and ratified, there are two areas that Europeans are very concerned about. The first is that there should be free and fair elections on October 28th, and the second, of course, is that the system of selective prosecutions, and the most visible of those, of course, is Yulia Tymoshenko and Yuri Lutsenko, that those cases should be revised, and that these opposition figures should be given an opportunity to participate in the political process. So these elections will be looked at very carefully by the Europeans, and I think the United States as well is cooperating and is very interested in both of these issues as well.
How do you see it?
Well, I think that this is very much a question whether President Yanukovych and his so-called family will be able to consolidate their authoritarian power or not. And I was just in Yalta and Kiev last week, and my sense is that it's not likely to do so. Instead, we are likely to see the oligarchs coming back. This looks to a considerable extent as a repetition of the 2002 elections. So I would expect a large number of oligarchic groups in parliament, factions or not, checking the Yanukovych family party going forward, while full democracy, of course, we cannot talk about.
What is the significance of this election for Ukraine democratic development at all?
Yeah, well, NDI just had a group in Ukraine, and the thing that struck us is that people have lost confidence in the electoral system. They don't think the election is going to be democratic or fair. To a much greater extent than we've seen before. So the selective prosecutions, the way the parliamentary election law was passed, all these things contribute. So there is an opportunity here for the government to try to regain some of the legitimacy that has been lost for the elections, and as a consequence for the parliament that will be elected. But they're going to have to work very hard to do it. It's a very steep hill at this point. There is such a loss of faith.
Ukraine has proven that they can run a credible election during Yushchenko period, and President Yanukovych actually promised. He said that we will organize a free and fair election. But Ukrainians lost, as you said, confidence and don't really believe that it's possible to have free and fair election. How would you assess the election process so far?
I mean, in our view, it's a number of things which have contributed to this lack of confidence. And some of them are things which I've already mentioned. The selective prosecutions is big. Some are things that are in the past, as the way the parliamentary election law was passed, the local elections. But there are still some things in the future that could start to restore confidence. The government could take very demonstrative steps against, for example, bribing voters and intimidating voters and misuse of administrative resources. These 12,000 social workers we've heard a lot about who are out campaigning. Second, they could make the elections demonstrably more transparent, guarantee the rights of observers who in the past haven't been able to stand close enough to watch the ballots being counted. Guarantee rights, equal access rights for the media, some kind of a must-carry provision, for example.
What about election commissions? Is there anything can be changed in that?
Well, it's disappointing the way these election commissions have been formed through these lotteries that have a single lottery in the country or in a single district. I'm not sure what can be done at this point. Certainly it increases the role, the importance of observers from civic groups and political parties, because the election commissions will not be able to check each other because they will not necessarily be balanced.
What is the future of next parliament?
Well, of course, when you have one-man constituencies, then you have a big advantage if you have a lot of money. So we are now seeing that the moneyed people are getting more advantage than previously. And the purpose of this was, of course, to give the opposition parties less possibility to compete.
What is your prediction for the who would get in, who would not, and how the parliament would be formed?
What I would expect is that we will see something like 10 different party factions in parliament. I think that the big news will be that the regions, or whatever remains of it, will be much smaller. So far we have seen a big flow of deputies going to the regions after the regions now probably has passed its peak with this election. I would expect that we will see deputies flowing out of the regions instead. As we know, the Ukrainian parliamentarians are very quick to move when they see where the flood is going.
What would be the basis for the majority?
Well, I don't know more than the opinion polls, and of course in the proportional part we would expect the united opposition to get about a quarter, and the regions to get about a quarter, and the communists and Klitschko, Sudar to get something like 10%. That these are the four parties that clearly are entering parliament, and then it's a question what will happen to the others who, if any, will pass the 5% threshold. And for the 225 individually elected parliamentarians, we would expect a lot of big businessmen or people related to businessmen. And I don't think that they will obey the Yanukovych family in the future.
But I think that the big struggle in Ukraine right now is on the question of how far do the political parties just as a whole represent the people. The opposition is putting itself in opposition to the ruling party, the ruling clans, the oligarchical forces, although there are oligarchical forces on the side of the opposition as well. But my sense is that there's a whole area of civil society activism that's going on that doesn't really connect to any of these political parties. And that's where I think for the future, these are problems that Ukraine has to resolve. They're not unique to Ukraine, by the way. The opposition as such, I mean, for the short term, I think they're doing very well, considering, and there have been times in the last 3 or 4 months where we've seen that public opinion polls have actually shown that the opposition, which would be, you know, Udar, Butte, and so on, have actually been in the ratings higher than the Party of Regions. But that's changed a little bit just in the last few weeks. But the ultimate question, I think, is, in the end, who do they represent? And in whose interest are they going into the parliament? What will they do when they get there? Will they be representing the interests of the people who voted for them?
U.S. State Department officials pointed to violation of election process in Ukraine. Assistant Secretary of State Philip Gordon talked about it last week in Washington.
We are therefore concerned by reports of harassment of independent and opposition outlets by local authorities, tax inspectors, and prosecutors' offices. Disappearance of independent television station TVI from cable operators in multiple cities has the appearance of a deliberate effort to silence one side in the pre-election debate. We urge the government of Ukraine to address these problems. We also have been very clear that we deeply regret that 2 imprisoned opposition leaders, former Prime Minister Tymoshenko and former Interior Minister Lutsenko, have been disqualified from participating in the election. As Secretary Clinton made clear on May 1st of this year, we call for Ms. Tymoshenko's release, the release of other members of the former government, and the restoration of their full civic and political rights.
One of the biggest issues, as Philip Gordon just mentioned, the prosecution of Yulia Tymoshenko, political opposition Yulia Tymoshenko and Yulia Lutsenko, and other political prisoners in Ukraine. The U.S. Senate recently passed a resolution in Ukraine calling for release of Tymoshenko and free and fair election. How seriously do you think Ukrainian government should take this document and other concern expressed by Europeans and American governments.
I want to make a point here that I think what the Ukrainian government needs to understand is that there is a very strong constituency in the United States, in the Senate and outside of government, for democracy and the rule of law and fair elections. I have sometimes heard from representatives of the Ukrainian government who've been in Washington that they consider this just an outgrowth of good PR by Ms. Tymoshenko, or that it is simply because there are so many members of the diaspora here, and they don't understand that there is a genuine homegrown sense of outrage at what has happened at this selective prosecution, and they need to respond to that.
Do you think they really take it seriously?
Well, I think that everybody outside of Ukraine takes this very seriously, and it's amazing that President Yanukovych obviously doesn't understand this. Last year in Yalta, he was promising publicly to push for legal changes so that Tymoshenko would not sit in prison, and he did nothing of the kind. And this is then a straightforward public lie that he has presented. And then he continues to that. And no Western politicians want to deal with a person who repeatedly and publicly and in privately lies and puts his opposition leaders into prison on no plausible legal ground. And if President Yanukovych had any serious political ambitions, he would let them out. And as long as he doesn't do that, nobody in the West, neither in the US nor in the European Union or even in Russia, want to deal with him. President Putin doesn't want to see President Yanukovych for reasons that I'm not quite clear about.
What do you think?
Well, this Senate resolution is just one item that has come out of the US Congress recently. There is, of course, the Magnitsky bill, which deals with Russia, but and with the death of a lawyer who was exposing corruption in Russia. And there is going to be a bill passed, we hope, soon, in the US Congress that will impose fairly strict visa bans on individuals from Russia who were perpetrators of who supported this difficult situation taking place in Russia. And so, I mean, the longer that Tymoshenko, Lutsenko, and the others stay in prison in Ukraine, the same idea occurs to people who are watching that situation, that, well, maybe we can actually transfer this sort of method of dealing with Ukrainian officials who have made them sit there, and also restrict their visas, take a look at their bank accounts that are in Western countries, take a look at the property that they own. I know that there was Mrs. Tymoshenko actually issued a letter a week or so ago, and the interesting approach that she took in her letter was actually that that there's a sort of group of corrupt oligarchs, businessmen who are actually subverting democracy, and she didn't make it specific to Ukraine, but actually indicated that this was more of a sort of global phenomenon, which is actually the Western democracies now are taking a closer look at this. So all of these issues have been raised through this.
Well, it should be added that in fact there is already a Magnitsky Act functioning for Ukraine. A large number of the top Ukrainian officials and public figures are blocked from entering the United States, either because of obvious connections with organized crime, as the FBI has established, or because they are considered human rights violators. And one person in Yalta spoke about this himself, Deputy Prosecutor General Rinat Kuzmin complained that he's being refused visa to the United States. And the attitude is simply that he's a human rights violator. So in a way, the Magnitsky Act for Ukraine is not needed. It already exists, and it's much tougher than towards Russia.
Philip Gordon, that we had him before, recently he linked Ukrainian election with the prospect of signing a free trade agreement with Europe and getting support from IMF.
The failure to have clearly free and fair elections will impede Ukraine's progress on all of the other things that Ukrainians care about. It will not be possible for the European Union to move forward on a free trade agreement and association agreement if Ukraine does not appear to have had fair elections and is continuing to pursue selective prosecutions. It won't be possible for the United States to pursue and develop this security and economic ties and investment if Ukraine doesn't have adequate elections. It won't be possible for the IMF to work with Ukraine in terms of the financial support that the country needs. So it's not just a matter, I mean, it's important enough to make people who live in Ukraine feel like they live in a place where they can express themselves freely and choose their own government. But there's more at stake than that.
Do you agree with Philip Gordon? How this election would influence the Ukrainian prospect for?
Well, there are two issues here institutionally. One is the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement that Ukraine negotiated with the European Union from 2007 until the fall of 2011. It's done. It's a major agreement. It's the most important agreement that Ukraine has ever concluded in the economic area, but it's not signed. It will not be signed by the European Union, and it will not be ratified as long as Tymoshenko and Lutsenko sit in prison. Because these are fundamental European values. This is not only a free trade agreement, it's a European association agreement. So it's totally up to the Ukrainian government to get it done or not. And this is of great value to the Ukrainian nation and to the Ukrainian economy. The IMF is quite different. Mm-hmm. The IMF is basically a completely non-political organization. The key demand from the IMF today is that gas prices are increased substantially by, say, 30 to 50%, depending on what gas prices we discuss. And this must be done before the IMF can provide Ukraine with any money. Clearly, the Ukrainian government is not prepared to do that before the winter or during the winter. So until the spring, the IMF cannot possibly conclude any agreement with Ukraine because the Ukrainian government is not prepared to do what is needed. And to increase the gas prices, this is very much an issue of doing away with massive rent seeking within the gas sector. Ukraine today subsidizes the importation of gas from Russia, pay 7 times more for that gas than for gas produced in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government absurdly is punishing the production of gas in Ukraine. Therefore, that production is falling. And this makes no sense apart from a few people, I don't know who obviously are buying gas at the low domestic price and sells it at a much 7 times higher price or so. And this is the activity that should be stopped.
What would happen after? If the election would not be considered free and fair, or if they would be considered free and fair? Do we have options here?
Well, it would be so easy to make these elections free and fair. I mean, there's still another month to go to release all of the instructions going to the media to make sure that administrative resources are not being used and actually make it a really free and fair election. However, we're going into these elections now knowing that this is actually a sort of watershed point. I know we've had many other watershed points in Ukraine before, but really, I think everyone looks at Ukraine now as a backsliding country, a big disappointment. Ukraine was the focus of attention around the world in 2004, such hopes were pinned on the ability of people, of citizens to have an uprising, to want freedom from an authoritarian government, and to be able to decide their own path, their own destiny. And we've seen that Ukraine has backslid dramatically, and in fact this has actually been documented by Freedom House's system of numbers. It's now in the same category as countries like Turkey, that's considered to be backsliding, a little bit Hungary as well. But Ukraine, I think, is the main one because it was just such a prominent symbol of hope. Just not so many years ago. So everyone is watching Ukraine in a sense to see what can happen when that kind of a movement has overtaken people. Again, I come back to the question of who will be the people in the new parliament. Whether it's more opposition, whether it's more pro-government people, but will they actually be representing the citizens of Ukraine? And what sort of role will the parliament actually eventually play in distributing power, agglomerating power, and actually deciding what goes on in Ukraine? Because we see that the locus of power has been moving elsewhere outside of the parliament lately. So even though we're hoping for free and fair elections, but there are many other struggles on different aspects of government power in Ukraine too.
Two things I want to add to what you said, Nadia. One thing is, as you mentioned, part of this whole electoral process will take place after the election. It's what happens when the new Rada is seated and whether there is, especially in the single mandate districts, what happens whether there are bribes or various enticements or pressure on single mandate candidates to join factions and to consolidate power that way. And so I think we need to be watching all the way through the process. On the larger question about what it means for, the fact I think that you continue to see these steps and these statements out of the U.S. government, for example, the resolution that's been introduced on sanctions, and then the resolution in the Senate. I mean, these are resolutions, they're not legislation. But I think they're trying to send a signal to the Ukrainian government that they're looking for they're giving them every chance, and they're looking for some progress back. And as Nadia said, there are some things they could do before there's still time to point Ukraine in a more democratic direction.
Your last word.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add on this. It's so obvious that Ukraine can benefit enormously, both domestically and in terms of international relations, if it does make some effort to show that the government cares about democracy.
Thank you so much, everyone.